Well, we have some fresh developments now coming in from Australia following the Bondi Beach shooting. Australian Prime Minister Anthony Albanese says that an independent review into law enforcement agencies set up after the Bondi mass shooting will assess whether authorities could have taken additional steps to prevent the terror attack. According to Albanese, the review will examine whether existing laws or information gaps stopped police and security agencies from acting against the alleged attackers, a father and son duo, who police say was inspired by the Islamic group Islamic State. 15 people were killed in the mass shooting at the Jewish Hanukkah celebration at Sydney's Bondi Beach on December 14. Shocking a country with strict gun laws and fueling calls for tougher controls and stronger action against anti-Semitism. And I now invite Erin Watson, who is the CEO at York and Baker. He joins us from Melbourne. Thank you very much, Ms. Watson, for joining me in this discussion. Ms. Watson, sitting here in India, we can say these steps are much required, but what's your assessment? You're there in Melbourne. Do you think the decision is crucial, especially because many have spoken about a possible intel gap or failure that led to the Bondi attack?
Hi, yeah, thank you very much for having me. It's a really good question. So sitting here in Australia, on one hand, you think, well, this is a really good step in the right direction that we've had this call for an independent review. However, if you speak to the Jewish community, there was demand for a royal commission, and these two are really distinctive in what you're able to do, whether you go down the path of an independent review versus a royal commission. So in terms of whether or not people will think it's serious enough, whether they think it will be in depth enough, whether they think it will have the legal powers to get the information that's required, that's a whole different question when it comes to a royal commission versus a review. Now, the person who's been appointed for the review, Dennis Richardson, is more than qualified, is a fantastic person to be leading this review, but whether or not it will go far enough, I think that is something that the Australian public are yet to sort of come out and say whether or not they're happy with this. So a little bit out for the jury still on this one.
Let's also talk about the question of gun laws. Erin, of course, Australia had announced a buyback plan, but there was also opposition coming in from gun dealers and gun lobbyists saying that, it will also affect many law-abiding gun holders in Australia. There was also the question of pest control. How do you think Albanese will be able to address their concerns while also preventing illicit such a terrorist use of weapons?
The good thing in Australia is that largely gun reform and gun laws and the reform of those laws is very bipartisan in Australia. Most Australians accept that someone living in Melbourne CBD or Sydney CBD or the suburbs of Sydney does not need to own a gun, let alone 6 guns. Now, that is not a political thing here, and that goes back to the success of John Howard's gun amnesty after the Port Arthur massacre back in the 1990s, and he obviously a conservative politician who led those reforms and really took the gun owners along for that ride. Now, who are gun owners in Australia? They largely live in regional areas, they might have farms. You would argue that there is a requirement for them to have a gun. Do they need 6? Probably not. So I don't think that these things are particularly political, and I think that those groups really do understand that as well. You don't really have people coming out marching in the streets like they did back in the 1990s saying that we should, that these gun reforms are going too far. I don't see that narrative here in Australia. What I would say is that it's interesting how Australians really do get on board with this stuff, and now they're seeing how someone has slipped through the cracks. They want to know why that was, why that could happen, and that's hopefully
trying to find out the facts as to what happened in terms of attacks on the car, etc., etc. Instead of resolving the issues, it basically aggravates the local suspicions. I suspect that what happened again, the protest and everything, is that originates out of this deep suspicion.
And with ISIS, usually it's not. So this is quite a unique scenario in Australia. The problem that we are facing, and we can see this in the streets day in, day out in Australia, is the rise of anti-Semitism.
Yeah.
Now, whether ISIS-backed individuals then support that, but we've seen bombings of synagogues in Australia. If you go to some of the protest marches in Melbourne on a weekend, you can see really vile anti-Semitic language that's displayed on signs and so on. Now, you should be able to go out and protest in Australia. Should you be able to go out and say such, incredibly awful anti-Semitic statements? I'm not quite sure. So I think it's when it comes to this particular case, noting that this was an attack on the Jewish community during Hanukkah. This is about anti-Semitism rather than a rise of radical Islam in Australia.
All right, sure. So even if the question of anti-Semitism is concerned, Jews are saying that there were enough warnings that were issued in advance. The attack was rather imminent. Even then, that threat was not tackled enough. How can that
Correct.
be addressed
Absolutely, absolutely. I think that the Jewish community has made that very clear in Australia, that they have felt very unsafe for a long time and an attack like this was imminent. And so I think that's a really sad state of affairs that we've got there. I think that, again, when we talk about this independent review, whether or not it goes far enough, and because it's not a royal commission, hopefully we'll get to some of the answers. Like, where was the failure in the system? Was it political? Was it to do with our security? Was it arrangements? Was it to do with something else? And identifying where those gaps are, because they're the answers that people want in Australia right now.
Erin, now, even though you've spoken about it already, but I don't think the question of radicalization, especially online, can be ignored, especially because these are not terrorists who had immigrated to Australia. They were, the son, at least, he was born in Australia and then decided to take up arms, right? And even recently, you would know how Australia has banned social media for under 16 kids, even though radicalization has not been mentioned as one of the reasons. Can that really be ignored as the, one of the key issues that's grappling Australian minors?
Let's be clear. I did not say that this is not an issue. Radicalisation doesn't exist. Radicalisation is a problem, is an issue that governments are grappling with around the world. Absolutely. Does the online environment help facilitate that? Yes. Did we see radicalisation prior to social media? Yes. Look at 9/11. I was 16 at that time, so I'm very aware of how radicalisation can come through without having to have the online environment fuel it, which it certainly does. I don't think that this is a debate about immigration either. This was an Australian-born person who was the son of the attackers. Well, one was a migrant. But, I do think that when it comes to radicalisation, that is a massive issue that governments are dealing with all around the world, including Australia. The under-16 ban on social media is trying to capture a whole range of different issues, including radicalisation, but that is not the primary target when it comes to social media. There's a whole bunch of other issues like child grooming, child exploitation, sexual exploitation. Sure. That's one of the absolute key issues with the social media ban. So, these are all pieces of a much, much bigger puzzle that are not unique to Australia, but are certainly playing out in an Australian context, which is quite unique.
All right. Finally, Erin, I'd like to ask you, would you say it's time for Australia to join the global chorus against extremist jihadists, that are actually carrying out such elements?
Well, look, I trying to link this whole thing to Islamic radicalisation, which is a part of it, is interesting. I can see why you're trying to do that. However, the government after this inquiry will make a call on what is the right mechanisms for Australia to be a part of.
I mean,
globally.
it's not I who's trying to link it. That's all the reports that have come out. So I'm only trying to address those reports with you since you are there in Melbourne.
Yeah, absolutely. But I think it is more than that. Like I said, one of the key drivers here is anti-Semitism, and radicalisation is one part of that anti-Semitic problem that we have in Australia right now, which goes well beyond what happened in Bondi. And so addressing that as a broader problem in Australia is absolutely essential, and this radicalisation and extremism is one part of that big problem. So like I said at the beginning, I don't think that Australia is seeing a broader trend of radicalisation, but it is a massive issue that we're dealing with as a country, as are many countries around the world.
All right then, thanks very much, Erin, for joining me in this discussion. It was a pleasure to speak with you. And with that, viewers, we're now going to move ahead